June 18, 1945. 9:14 a.m. An internment facility outside Lethbridge, Alberta. The summons came through the barracks like a ripple, quiet, uncertain. All women to the medical station. Immediately. Not a request. An order. The kind that made your stomach tighten, made you think of examinations, inspections, the 100 small humiliations that came with being powerless. 39 women filed out into the June morning, their footsteps crunching gravel in a rhythm that sounded too much like dread. The medical station was a converted storage building, whitewashed, marked with a red cross that meant nothing and everything. They'd been at the camp for 2 weeks. Long enough to know the routine. Not long enough to trust it. Inside, a Canadian nursing sister stood beside a table covered with small brown parcels. She was maybe 40, with the calm competence of someone who'd seen enough that surprise had become impossible. She spoke in careful German. "These are for you. Monthly supplies. Take what you need." Silence. Then someone understood. And the crying began. One woman, Anna, a clerk from Dresden who'd spent the last months of the war managing paperwork for a unit that no longer existed, would write weeks later, "I had forgotten I was still a woman." They remembered when I had forgotten. They expected inspection. They got dignity. And somehow dignity was harder to bear than cruelty. The moment unfolds with the weight of all accumulated loss pressing against unexpected grace. June 1945. The war had been over for 6 weeks, but its aftershocks continued to reverberate through millions of displaced lives. Among those lives were the women auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the Stabshelferinnen, the administrative and communications personnel who'd kept the military bureaucracy functioning until there was no bureaucracy left to maintain. When Canadian forces swept through northwestern Germany in the war's final weeks, they encountered these women in abandoned offices, communications posts, supply depots. Most surrendered without resistance. Some were simply there when the Canadians arrived, still at their posts because leaving required agency they no longer possessed. The Canadians documented them, processed them, and, faced with thousands of women who occupied a legal gray area between combatant and civilian, transported many across the Atlantic to internment facilities in Canada. The crossing took 12 days on Liberty ships, in holds that had been modified for human cargo but still smelled of machine oil and seawater. The women were seasick, frightened, and increasingly aware that they'd been surviving on adrenaline and denial for so long that their bodies had simply stopped maintaining functions that weren't essential to immediate survival, including the most basic functions of being a woman. In the chaos of Germany's collapse, in the months of fleeing and hiding and surviving, feminine hygiene had become another casualty. Supplies had been scarce even before the war ended. After, they were impossible. Women used rags when they had rags. Nothing when they didn't. They endured the monthly cycle as another indignity in a long catalogue of indignities, another reminder that their bodies were something to be managed, hidden, ashamed of. When they arrived in Canada they expected more of the same. Or worse. The facility at Lethbridge had been a training camp, converted to house German internees. Wooden barracks, adequate fencing, guard towers that were mostly symbolic. The women were processed on arrival. Names, ages, last postings, medical screening. The medical screening was brief, professional, conducted by a Canadian military doctor who checked for infectious diseases and malnutrition but otherwise maintained the clinical distance appropriate for prisoners. Except they weren't quite prisoners. The Geneva Convention was ambiguous about their status. Not soldiers, not quite civilians. The Canadians settled on civilian internees and applied adapted POW protocols. Which meant, among other things, that medical care fell under military medical services oversight. Which meant someone had to think about the practical realities of housing 39 women in their teens and 20s and 30s, all of whom had functioning reproductive systems and all of whom had been living without access to basic hygiene supplies for months. Someone did think about it. A nursing sister, Captain Margaret Fraser, a career military nurse from Halifax who'd served since 1941, put in a requisition 2 days after the women arrived. Standard medical supplies for female internees, sanitary napkins, belts, soap, analgesics for menstrual pain. The requisition went up the chain. Got approved. Got filled from Canadian military medical stores. Got delivered to the camp on a Tuesday morning. Fraser unpacked the boxes herself. Counted out supplies. Set them on a table in the medical station. Then sent word to the barracks. The women entered the medical station warily, expecting examination or interrogation or some new bureaucratic requirement. They found Fraser standing beside the table, her expression neutral but not unkind. "These are standard medical supplies," she said in German that was grammatically correct but accented. For your monthly needs. Take what you require. There will be more when these run out. If you need pain medication, I can provide that as well. If you have questions, ask. The women stared at the parcels. Small brown paper-wrapped packages. Standard military issue. Unremarkable. Except they were remarkable. They represented acknowledgment that women's bodies had needs beyond just staying alive. That dignity extended beyond food and shelter to the small, intimate realities of being female. Anna was first to step forward. She picked up a package, held it with the same careful reverence you'd hold something precious and fragile. We can just take these? Yes. How many? As many as you need. They're yours. One by one, the women approached the table. Some took packages quickly, shoving them into pockets as if afraid the offer might be rescinded. Others lingered, touching the wrapping paper, verifying that this was real. Several cried, quietly, turning away, wiping tears with the backs of their hands because crying in front of captors felt like weakness and they'd been trained to show no weakness. But Fraser didn't leave. Didn't dismiss them. She stood there, present, and said something that changed everything. You should not have to endure your cycle without proper supplies. That's not punishment. That's simply cruelty. And cruelty is not Canadian policy. She named it, Anna wrote. The thing we'd been enduring without naming. She called it what it was, cruelty, and said they would not do it. That acknowledgement broke something in me. Or fixed something. I'm still not sure which. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. The policy behind this provision was both bureaucratic and humane, though the two were not as separate as they might seem. A directive from Canadian Army Medical Services, issued in April 1945 in preparation for receiving female internees, specified that female prisoners shall be provided with sanitary supplies appropriate to their biological needs, to be requisitioned through normal medical channels and distributed under nursing supervision. The language was clinical. The reasoning was practical. Women who lacked basic hygiene supplies were at risk for infection, for toxic shock, for a cascade of medical problems that would require more resources to treat than prevention would require to avoid. From a purely logistical standpoint, providing sanitary napkins was cheaper than treating the consequences of not providing them. But beneath the bureaucracy was something harder to quantify. The directive's final paragraph read, "Dignity in detention serves multiple purposes, medical, diplomatic, and moral. Female prisoners retain the right to manage their biological functions with privacy and appropriate materials. This is not luxury. This is baseline humane treatment. Security, health, dignity." The Canadians, it seemed, understood that civilization was measured not by how you treated those who had power but by how you treated those who had none. The days after the distribution acquired a different quality. The women still did their assigned work, kitchen duty, laundry, cleaning. Still attended roll call morning and evening. Still lived within the fencing and guard rotations that marked them as internees. But something had shifted. The provision of those small brown packages had signaled something beyond mere survival. It had signaled that their captors saw them not just as bodies to be maintained but as women with specific needs that deserved acknowledgement. One afternoon, Anna found herself working kitchen duty alongside Captain Fraser, who occasionally helped with meal preparation when the regular staff was short-handed. They peeled potatoes in companionable silence until Anna asked, "Why?" Fraser looked up. "Why what?" "The supplies. Why provide them?" Fraser set down her knife. "Because you need them. That's sufficient reason. But we're prisoners. The enemy. You're internees. There's a difference. And even if you were prisoners, even if you were enemy combatants, which you're not, you'd still be entitled to basic medical care. That includes managing your menstrual cycle with dignity." In Germany toward the end. Anna stopped, unsure how to continue. How to explain that dignity had become the first casualty, that women had learned to endure everything in silence because speaking made you vulnerable. "I know," Fraser said quietly. "Or I can imagine. But you're not in Germany now. You're here. And here we maintain standards. Even when, especially when, it would be easier not to." She gave me no absolution, Anna wrote. Just the promise of standards. That was more valuable than forgiveness. It was the foundation on which everything else could be rebuilt. Greta had been a typist at a Wehrmacht supply depot, 24 years old, efficient, someone who'd survived by being indispensable. She'd spent the final months typing requisitions for supplies that would never arrive, managing inventory for warehouses that had been bombed empty, maintaining the bureaucratic fiction that the system still functioned. At Lethbridge, she struggled with the cognitive dissonance of captivity that included dignity. She attended the daily distributions. Captain Fraser had organized a system where women could come to the medical station weekly for supplies, maintaining privacy and consistency, but each time felt like accepting something she hadn't earned. One afternoon, Fraser noticed her hesitation. Is something wrong with the supplies? No. They're adequate. But. Greta struggled for words. I don't understand why you're doing this. We lost. You won. Why not just, let us manage as we can? Fraser considered the question seriously. Because winning a war doesn't mean abandoning basic humanity. It means maintaining it under pressure. If we treated you with cruelty, we'd be admitting that cruelty is acceptable when you have power. That's not a principle I'm willing to establish. Even for enemies? Especially for enemies. How we treat those we defeat says more about us than about them. She made dignity a weapon, Greta wrote. Not against us but against the idea that power justified cruelty. I had spent the war believing might made right. She showed me that restraint made civilization. I'm still processing that lesson. Liesel was 19, a radio operator who'd spent 8 months monitoring Allied transmissions in a bunker that shook with every bombardment. She'd been the youngest at her station, trained hastily, deployed immediately into work that required precision under conditions that made precision nearly impossible. At Lethbridge, she found herself grateful for the supplies but ashamed of the gratitude. Gratitude implied debt, and debt to your captors felt like betrayal. Of what, she wasn't sure anymore, but of something. She tried to articulate this to another internee, Margaret, who at 32 was old enough to have perspective but young enough to remember different possibilities. They're just doing their job, Margaret said. Providing supplies is policy, not personal. But it feels personal. That's because you've forgotten what normal feels like. Normal includes not bleeding through your clothes. Normal includes privacy for bodily functions. Normal includes being treated like a human being with a body that does human things. They're not being generous. They're being normal. We've just forgotten what that looks like. She was right, Liesel wrote. But relearning normal was harder than surviving abnormal. Survival had rules. Normal required trust. I didn't know how to trust anymore. The transformation happened in increments too subtle to mark but too significant to ignore. Women who'd been hunched and defensive began standing straighter. Not pride, they had nothing to be proud of, but something like dignity reclaimed. The small brown packages represented more than just medical supplies. They represented acknowledgment that even in defeat, even in captivity, they retained the right to manage their bodies with privacy and appropriate materials. One afternoon, a new group of internees arrived, 15 women from a different facility, transferred for administrative reasons. They looked the way Anna's group had looked 2 months earlier, wary, exhausted, expecting the worst. Anna watched as Captain Fraser conducted the same briefing, provided the same supplies, offered the same matter-of-fact dignity. She watched the same disbelief, the same tears, the same slow acceptance that maybe, impossibly, their captors intended to maintain basic human decency. After the new arrivals left, Anna approached Fraser. Do you do this with all of them? Every group? Yes. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. And because every woman who experiences this will remember it. They'll go back to Germany eventually. They'll rebuild. And maybe, they'll remember that their enemies treated them better than their own side did. Maybe that memory will matter. Maybe it won't. But we'll have done our duty regardless of outcome. She planted seeds, Anna wrote. Seeds of doubt in everything we'd been told. Seeds of possibility that maybe civilization could survive the worst. I don't know if those seeds grew in everyone, but they grew in me. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. August brought the news of Japan's surrender and the war's complete end. The camp organized a subdued acknowledgment, not celebration given the circumstances, but recognition that a chapter had closed. That evening, Captain Fraser organized an informal gathering in the medical station, not required but open to any internee who wanted to attend. She prepared tea and cookies from the mess hall stores, arranged chairs in a rough circle. About 20 women came. They sat awkwardly, unsure what was expected. Fraser poured tea, passed cookies, and then simply sat with them. After a long silence, Greta asked, "What happens now? To us?" "You'll be repatriated. Probably September or October. Back to the British occupation zone in Germany, most likely. You'll be processed, documented, and released. And until then? Until then, life continues here. Same routines. Same provisions. Same standards. Another silence. Then Margaret asked the question they'd all been avoiding. Why have you been kind to us? We're Germans. We're the enemy. Your side won. Fraser was quiet for a long moment. Kindness is the wrong word. I haven't been kind. I've been professional. I've provided the care that medical regulations require and that human decency demands. There's no special virtue in that. It's simply my job. But you could have done less. Provided less. No one would have questioned it. No one except me. And I have to live with myself after this war ends. I want to live with someone who maintained standards even when it was inconvenient. That's not kindness. That's integrity. She refused to be exceptional, Anna wrote. She insisted that decency was ordinary, that maintaining dignity was simply what professionals did. That insistence, that this was normal, not special, changed how I understood morality. Goodness wasn't heroic. It was simply choosing to do right when doing wrong would be easier. September brought repatriation orders. Lists posted. Transportation arranged. The women would be sent back to Germany via military transport, then processed through British occupation facilities. In the final weeks, Captain Fraser made sure each woman received a personal supply of hygiene products for the journey, enough for 2 months, wrapped in brown paper and packed into their Red Cross parcels. She also provided written instructions in German for accessing medical care and supplies in the occupation zone. The night before departure, Anna couldn't sleep. She found herself outside the medical station, drawn by memory or gratitude or something she couldn't name. The door was unlocked. Inside, Fraser was doing inventory, preparing for the next group of internees. Can't sleep? Fraser asked. No, ma'am. Fraser set down her clipboard. Nervous. Terrified. I don't know what Germany looks like now. I don't know if my family survived. I don't know anything except that I'm going back to nothing. You're going back to possibility. It's not nothing. It's just undefined. Anna was quiet. Then, thank you. For everything. For treating us like we were still human. Fraser's expression softened slightly. You were always human. You just forgot. We didn't let you forget entirely. That's all. It was more than that. To you perhaps. To me it was simply the job. But I'm glad it mattered. She gave me no special recognition, Anna wrote. No acknowledgement that what she'd done was extraordinary. She insisted it was ordinary, that this was simply how things should be. That insistence haunted me more than gratitude could. It set a standard I've spent my life trying to meet. The departure came on a gray morning. Trucks waited. Women boarded carrying their parcels, their supplies, the small accumulations of captivity. As they drove through the gates, some looked back at the medical station, the building where they'd first understood that their captors intended to treat them as human beings with bodies that had needs. Captain Fraser stood watching. Not waving. Just present, bearing witness to their departure the way she'd witnessed their arrival. When the last truck disappeared, she returned to the medical station and began preparing for the next group. There would always be another group. There would always be more women who needed to remember they were human. What happened to them after is a mosaic of letters, records, and plausible reconstruction. Anna returned to Dresden and found her city destroyed, her family scattered, her life reduced to rubble and memory. She worked for British Occupation Medical Services as a translator, emigrated to Canada in 1949, and became a nurse herself. She specialized in women's health, working in community clinics in Toronto until her retirement in 1985. In her desk drawer she kept one of the original brown packages, empty but preserved. When asked why, she said simply, to remember that dignity is a choice, not a circumstance. Greta went to Munich, found work with the Canadian Occupation Administration, and eventually married a Canadian officer. She moved to Alberta in 1951, not to Lethbridge but close enough that she sometimes drove past the old camp, converted to other uses. She raised 4 children, worked as a school secretary, and wrote a memoir in 1997 that included a chapter titled, The Brown Packages. She sent a copy to Captain Fraser, by then retired in Nova Scotia. Fraser's response was brief, I'm glad it mattered. It was simply the job. Fraser. Liesel struggled for years. She returned to Berlin, found it divided and unrecognizable, and spent decades working in jobs that didn't require thinking about the past. She never married, never spoke about the war except to say, when pressed, that she'd learned more about humanity in captivity than she'd learned in freedom. She died in 2004. Among her effects was a letter, unsent, addressed to Captain Fraser. You gave me dignity when I had no right to expect it. That gift sustained me through decades of trying to understand my own complicity. Thank you for treating me as human when I'd forgotten how. Margaret stayed in the British zone, worked in hospital administration, and spent her life in roles that required organizing care for the vulnerable. In a 1989 interview for an oral history project, she said, "Lethbridge taught me that civilization is defined by how you treat those who cannot demand better treatment. The Canadians could have provided less. No one would have stopped them. They provided what dignity required because that's what civilized people do. That lesson shaped everything I did afterward." The story does not end with redemption because redemption implies a transaction. Suffering balanced against virtue, accounts settled. These women didn't earn their dignity through good behavior or moral transformation. They were simply treated as human beings because treating humans humanely is what civilization requires. But treatment has consequences. Not immediate, not direct, but real. Every distribution of those brown packages, every acknowledgement that women's bodies had needs that deserved privacy and appropriate materials, every small moment when dignity was maintained even toward the defeated, these accumulated into an education about what civilization meant when maintained under pressure. 70 years later, a historian conducting research on Canadian internment camps interviewed a retired nursing sister who'd served at multiple facilities during and after the war. She remembered the female internees, remembered the distributions, remembered the tears. "Why did you do it?" the historian asked. "Provide the supplies, I mean. Was it policy or personal choice?" The woman, 94, still sharp, smiled slightly. "Both. It was policy because someone had thought about what female internees would need and made sure regulations covered it. It was personal because I could have met the minimum requirement and done no more. But the minimum wasn't sufficient. They needed acknowledgement that they were women, not just bodies to be maintained. So I made sure they understood, this is normal. This is what we provide. You deserve this not because you've earned it but because you're human." Did it make a difference? I don't know. I hope so. But even if it didn't, we maintain standards. And that matters even if no one ever thanks you for it. In another interview, conducted in Germany in 2003, a former internee, by then 81, was asked what she remembered most about her captivity in Canada. She was quiet for a long time. Then, the brown packages. The sanitary supplies. Such a small thing. But it represented everything. It said, "We see you as a woman, not just a prisoner. We acknowledge your body has needs. We will meet those needs because that's what civilized people do." I spent 60 years trying to pass that lesson forward. Trying to treat vulnerable people with the same dignity I was shown. I don't know if I succeeded. But I tried. Because someone showed me it was possible. If this story moved you, if it challenged what you thought you knew, subscribe. History is full of moments like this, hidden in plain sight. Don't miss the next one. The brown packages that waited on a table in a medical station in June 1945 echoed through decades. They were not generous. They were not special. They were simply adequate, supplies provided because regulations required it and decency demanded it. But adequacy, it turned out, was revolutionary for women who'd learned to expect nothing, who'd been taught that their bodies' needs were shameful, who'd survived by suppressing every requirement that wasn't essential to immediate survival. The Canadian nursing sister who requisitioned those supplies, who distributed them with matter-of-fact dignity, who insisted that this was normal rather than exceptional, she was not a hero. She was simply a professional doing her job according to standards that applied even to defeated enemies. But professionalism, it turned out, was a form of mercy when applied with integrity. The women who received those packages learned something propaganda had tried to prevent them from learning, that their enemies were capable of decency. That civilization could survive total war. That dignity was not something you earned but something you retained simply by being human, even when you'd lost everything else. It was not redemption. But it was recognition. The simple, profound acknowledgement that women's bodies had needs that deserved appropriate materials and privacy. That menstruation was not shameful but natural. That managing it with dignity was not luxury but baseline human treatment. The war had taught them to expect cruelty disguised as efficiency, suffering rationalized as necessity. The captivity, strange and uncomfortable and shot through with all the complications of defeat, taught them something harder, that decency was possible even from those you'd been told were monsters. That standards could be maintained even under the pressure of victory. That small brown packages, distributed without ceremony, could represent the difference between degradation and dignity. They expected inspection. They got supplies. And in that gap between fear and provision, between shame and acknowledgement, the future became imaginable again.